So we are recording now, and we're about to go live in a minute.
Hey. This meeting is being recorded. Continue.
Part 2. Part 2. And we will be going live in 1 moment on Facebook.
Thing from Jeopardy?
Yes. Let's see.
I think we're in.
We are in. We are live, and I just want to say hello to people who may be tuning in live or tuning in to this recording after the fact on our Facebook and YouTube. Please share and repost. If you're not subscribed to our YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube. And if you do not like our page on the Episcopal Church of St. John the Baptist, like our page. Because the more likes we have, the more expansion of our stuff that we post goes out. And so, hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
It's good to see some of y'all. I saw some of y'all at our social hour that we're doing the second and fourth Sunday of the month, just to get together. Some of you I do see at church, and others, this is the only place I get to see you. So I'm glad to see you here. We have been studying the life of Joseph, and the last time we left Joseph is being sold off into slavery in Egypt. And so, but there's a chapter that gets skipped in all of this. We go from chapter 37 to chapter 39, and there's a whole story that is about Judah, which is Joseph's brother, and Tamar. And the gist of this story and why it fits in to the greater Joseph narrative, even though at first look it has nothing to do with Joseph, it is that Judah has a son, and this son is married to Tamar, and he basically dies. So basically the next son has to take on the wife, and so they're afraid that she might be some kind of black widow. And so none of the sons want to marry her or have a child with her in various ways. Either because if they do have a child with her, it will count for the brother that died. It won't count for them. Some of them are afraid that they might die. She's just seen as this black widow, and all the sons, she kind of goes through all the sons that she can until Judah's youngest son. And so Judah tells her, hey, you wait till he gets older and then I'll give him to you. Well, she knew that wasn't going to happen. So Judah's wife dies, And he's going up to one of the other villages, and he sees this fine-looking woman standing on the side of the street. She has a veil on, and he assumes, it's a prostitute. And so he sleeps with her. And then he realizes that he left some things. I think it's like a staff and some kind of signet thing to identify him. It would almost be for us like leaving a wallet. And he goes back to retrieve it. Where's the prostitute? I need my things back. And then she realized that they're like, there's no prostitute here. And Tamar comes out with all of this stuff. Because the law said, and even though the law that we know as the law of Moses was not given, there are certain rules that were still given that, if you marry one brother and the wife dies or the brother dies, then another brother takes his place and so on, so that you can raise up a legacy, and nobody was doing that. At first glance, it looks like it has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about with Joseph, but it does, because what the biblical writer is doing what every good movie does, every good book. It's giving a flashback. Now we're at Joseph, and the scene now switches to Judah. Because what the biblical writer is going to show is that Judah didn't do the right thing and had to be tricked to do the right thing. And you can go back and read the story. Joseph is going to do the right thing. And because Judah and Joseph are the main two brothers who get a lot of quote-unquote screen time, and so it is putting them juxtaposition together and comparing the two. Because as we get into the story of Joseph and Potiphar and his wife, we'll understand some things on that. I just wanted to give you just a brief background of why we skipped that chapter. And that it does have something to do with the story of Joseph. It's just not part. You can take it out and still have the whole story. Many scholars say that this story was kind of inserted in. But other scholars say that this chapter is part of the original story of Joseph. And for those reasons of comparing Joseph and Judah together and, flashing back and so forth. But we do finally make it to Joseph. Joseph is in Egypt. And if you have your study guide, you might want to get that out, because we're going to have to look at this study guide, at least for this part, even before we get into the scripture itself. And so I titled this Bible study, Joseph Living with a Lonely Heart. You'll always notice that there will be, we have a big title and then we have a subtitle. So we have to talk about Joseph's relationship to Egypt and the context of Joseph in Egypt. And so Joseph is a slave immigrant. And the reason I put those two terms together is that we know that he was sold into slavery, but he's also an immigrant to a foreign land. And I did not want to play down because, there are some people when they talk about slavery here in America and African-American slaves, they're just immigrants. Immigrants come freely to a country. Slaves are brought here. But I wanted to put the theme of immigration in here is to talk about it. And so let's look over to some of these things. Let's look over that how did Egypt relate to the Canaanites and the different tribes that are there. And so, as we pointed out earlier in a Bible study, we talked about how Egyptian records show Semitic peoples, and Semitic peoples not only include what we now know as Hebrews, but all of the Canaanite tribes, clothed in multicolored and long flowing robes. We talked about that in relation to his coat of many colors. We know that Semitic peoples came from Canaan to Egypt. There's a story earlier on in the book of Genesis where Abraham comes and visits the Pharaoh in Egypt. There's a famine. So every time there's a famine in Canaan, the natural migration is to Egypt. Why? Because Egypt is the breadbox of that region. It is the empire that is in charge. In fact, Isaac gets into a same there when Isaac they have a famine during the time of Isaac, and Isaac is planning to go down there as well because he says, well, my dad did it back then, I should go down there. But the Lord said, no, trust me, I'm going to prosper you where you're at, even in the midst of famine. When Abraham goes to Egypt, he gets in trouble because of his lovely wife / half-sister cousin type thing, because Sarah was kin to him in some way. And he basically told Sarah that you tell the Pharaoh and the court and whoever tries to talk to you that I'm your brother. Because if they find out that you're my wife, they might want to kill me to get you. Well, the story says that Pharaoh falls in love with Sarah and takes her to be his wife. And then he breaks out like leprosy or something. He gets some kind of disease, and he has a dream when he goes to sleep. And Yahweh comes to the dream and said, that's Abraham's wife. Don't touch her. He's a holy man. And then Pharaoh comes out and goes, why did you lie to me? And he says, well, technically I didn't. She is kind of my half-sister, you know, and kind of tribal relation. And so Abraham has to pray for him and order him to be healed. So there's always been this relationship throughout the Bible of Egypt and Israel. We usually think of Egypt and the Israelites when it comes to the liberation of the Israelite slaves, which we'll talk about in our next Bible story series. But you had these peoples coming in and out of Egypt, going back and forth. And so you also have Semitic persons who rose to power in the Egyptian empire. So when we get to the point of Joseph rising to power, it's not an anomaly. It's not a first-time thing. Others have done that as well because of the free flow. However, we also know that Semitic peoples traded goods between Egypt and Canaan. And so they traded the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. Remember, they're trading goods. That's how the brothers see this caravan going to Egypt. Let's get rid of our brother. We also know that the Egyptians traded in Semitic slaves, and that the Egyptians view Semitic peoples who practice shepherding as unclean. They didn't like them. We see that later on, and we'll get into that when the brothers come and visit Joseph, and before he reveals himself to the brothers, they're having a dinner together, and the brothers are separated from the rest of the Egyptians. And we also know that Joseph takes on an Egyptian name and takes an Egyptian wife when he became the vizier of Egypt, or the prime minister of Egypt. But, you know, one of the things that I was doing some research on is what language did Joseph speak? Because Hebrew, as we know it, was not a language spoken back then. There was probably some version of it. And so a lot of scholars and people who are trying to place Joseph in his historical context would say that Joseph would have had to learn the Egyptian language of the Middle Kingdom, which was both spoken and written in hieroglyphs, as well as being immersed into the culture. So during the time that we can pinpoint where Joseph could have been, and we'll get into exactly where he may not have been. We do know that this is a very high time for culture in Egypt. Language is being fully developed, not only spoken, but also written language. This is where you probably have the building of some of the pyramids and so forth and so on. But he also has to be immersed in the culture. Now think about this. Here is a scared, young man from a small but very kind of powerful tribe in his region, and now he is in the big city. I mean, here he is going from a rural life to going into the big city of the empire. And so now he has to learn the culture. He has to learn the language. He has to learn the religion of what they do. I mean, this is human trafficking going on. This is slavery going on. He is forced and uprooted from his tribal land with his with who his God is, and now thrust in a whole new place. I imagine, and we'll get to that. I'll get to that in a minute when we get to actually into the text. But the language he would have spoken would have been a Semitic language, and it would included influences of Aramaic and Akkadian and Cushite and Ugaritic languages. These were kind of the languages that were spoken. Akkadian became the major language later on in the Egyptian Empire. That's how they talked to people in Cana. So Joseph could have known some tribal languages as tribals interacted, and they would have to at least know enough maybe of Egyptian to get by, especially if they're going in. But we do know later on that Joseph does talk to his brothers through an interpreter, because he doesn't want them to know that he understands them. And so he is stripped away from his culture, stripped away from his religion, stripped away of everything of his identity. When that coat of many colors were stripped from him, he was stripped of his identity, and now there is this, now his identity has to be reformed. Who is Joseph? And really, in this sense, he is stripped away from his daddy, and he's really an extension of his daddy, if you want to go into psychological terms. There has not been a great break of individuality of Joseph. Well, now the break has come. And now Joseph is being formed into who he is as an individual. Now, we have two major sections of Egyptian history where Joseph could have been situated, where this story takes place. One is very early on in what we call the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. There's the Old Kingdom, which is, the ancient roots of Egypt. There's the Middle Kingdom where we're at. This also includes certain parts almost up to the Exodus, and then the New Kingdom. And that's what you read about later on in Israelites' dealings with Egypt when they're settled into the land. And so some scholars say that it's an earlier date. And this is the reason why, is that there are Egyptian names and they're not Semitic names. Joseph takes an Egyptian name, and I'll explain that in a minute. Joseph shaves himself according to Egyptian custom before he goes and sees Pharaoh. The burial and embalming practices reflect Egyptian practices. Egyptians despise shepherding, as we've said. And there was a land centralization under a vizier in the reign of Senusret III. He was a pharaoh. And kind of the way that's described almost matches Joseph. Others put the rise of Joseph in the Egyptian empire a little bit later on in what they call the Hyksos reign. And that's C on page 2. Now, the Hyksos were Semitic people, so they were people's kin to the Hebrews and the Canaanites. And they invaded the lower eastern delta and ruled Egypt for over 200 years. And see, Joseph is a Semitic from Canaan. So some scholars says, well, the reason he's able to rise up is because he's got kinfolk in high places. And so there's also Goshen, where the land that was given to Jacob at the end of the story to settle in, that's where they're at in the book of Exodus, fits with Semitic rulers of Egypt giving land to their Semitic cousins. And the Hyksos were prejudiced against shepherds, not because of race, but because of class. And that we know that shepherds from Syria, Palestine, which would have been Canaan and where Israel is, migrated to the deltas during drought time. Some people prefer the older setting. Some people prefer the newer setting. And they choose between the two on where do you place the Exodus at? Where you place that at in history affects the period of where Joseph would be. So that's just some historical stuff that I do want to include in this. This is the setting. Egypt is a cosmopolitan place. It is the ruling empire of the day. You do have these wandering tribes coming in and out. And sometimes they have great access to the pharaohs, sometimes they don't. And so this is where Joseph emerges. But there is a break between him and a tribal society. And also there's a break in the sense of he is now, his whole identity has been shattered. The things of who he is has been stripped from him. And then we now go to Genesis 39. I will be reading from the New Jerusalem Bible. You may have a different translation that says things. But it says, now Joseph had been taken down into Egypt. Potiphar, the Egyptian, one of Pharaoh's officials, the commander of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Yahweh was with Joseph, and everything he undertook was successful. He lodged in the house of his Egyptian master, and when his master saw how Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh made everything he undertook successful, he was pleased with Joseph and made him his personal assistant. And his master put him in charge of all the household, entrusting him with all of his possessions. And from the time he put him in charge of his household and all of his possessions, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's household out of consideration for Joseph. Yahweh's blessing extended all the, but let me get back to it. Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's household out of consideration for Joseph. Yahweh's blessing extended all his possessions, both household and estate. So he left Joseph to handle all of his possessions, and with him there concerned himself with nothing beyond the food he ate. So we got to stop right here. We've got to talk about some things. In verse 2 is the first time that God is mentioned ever in this story. In the Joseph part, if we take out the Tamar and Judah. But working in Joseph's life, this is the first time that God is mentioned. And not only is God mentioned, it is not kind of the generic name for God that sometimes the patriarchs would call God, like El Shaddai or El. El for God is like a generic term for God, like we would say God is a generic term. But this is the specific God of the covenant. This is Yahweh. And so he is sold into slavery. He is stripped of everything he has. And yet he still has his God. Which is good news for all of us. We can go through some things and get stripped of everything that makes us us. Everything that we thought was so important. And we can be stripped of everything. But that doesn't mean that we're stripped of God. And so he is taken down to Egypt. Potiphar the Egyptian, one of Pharaoh's officials and commander of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And Yahweh was with Joseph, and everything he undertook was successful. So now we have interplay of three characters here in this story. We have Joseph, and we're introduced to Potiphar, and we're introduced to God in this story, in this particular story, that God has shown up. And so we got to talk about first Joseph's relationship to Yahweh, and then we'll talk about his relationship to Potiphar and who Potiphar is, because it plays in the dynamics of the story. My script, my Bible says in verse 2 that Yahweh was with Joseph and everything he undertook was successful. Your translation may say, in the hand of Yahweh, or the hand of the Lord in capital letters, was on Joseph. And you have to realize that having the hand of God upon you means, number one, you are marked out by God. Number two, it represents God's power and God's favor upon his life. That's what that other part says, that everything that Joseph did was successful. It's God's favor is upon Joseph. And the reason that it is Yahweh and not the generic God is because this text is about faithfulness. This text, as it plays out, as we begin to talk about it, will give us two things. It is God's faithfulness to Joseph. God is with Joseph. God has not left Joseph. And it is Joseph's faithfulness to God. And so Yahweh, this is also on page 2 in your study guide. So you have everything that I'm saying, basically. That Yahweh prospered everything that Joseph did. Which tells us that the blessing of Yahweh extended to all aspects of Potiphar's life. Why? Because Joseph is there. Now you got to realize something. What is happening, and notice in our text, especially in the translation of the text I'm using, it says that God blessed Potiphar for the sake of Joseph, because of Joseph being there. Now, why is God doing this? Because this goes back to a promise that God made to Abraham. And in that promise, he always tells Abraham, you know, consider the stars of the sky, consider the sands of the beaches or the desert, and as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the desert, I am going to multiply you. And that what did he tell Abraham? I have blessed you to be a blessing to the nations. And a lot of times, the way we look at God's blessing on our life is that it's about us. It includes us, but it's not about us. And in this process, what you will learn about Joseph is that Joseph is learning that it is not about him. That is not just about him. It's about God working in him and through him. You also see in this is that Yahweh, God, works in our everyday life, empowering us and working through us to empower others. God is working through the day-to-day activities of Joseph being faithful in what God has given him. And so a lot of times we only think that having an experience with God has to be something very extraordinary. We think of the burning bush. We think of the visions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what Joseph is learning is that in the day-to-day of your life, as you offer up all that you are to God, God can work extraordinary things through your ordinary ways. And I think that's something we have to learn, because we're always asking the question where God is working and how can I join God and where is God inviting me? And we're always seeking an encounter with God. And in that encounter, we miss God. I'll tell you a story. When I was in seminary, I was a part of a small church plant. And as seminarians, we would always set up for church. And there's two of us. Well, it was my turn to help. And we preset the table. And I'm supposed to get the priest host and everything else. Well, guess who forgot to put the big priest host on the table? Me. So when it comes to the consecration, the pastor, the rector of the church, since we're a church plant, he would have been a vicar of the church, holds up the tiny wafer. You know what you receive in communion, a little one. And not only that, just like what I do with when I'm lifting up the host and breaking the host, he breaks this tiny wafer into 4 pieces. Okay. And it was the custom of the house that the seminarians would take from the priest host, because we were training to be priests. Guess who got small pieces? Smidgets. Maybe, a little bit bigger than a crumb. We did. Baby Jesus. We got baby Jesus. And I go sit down. And this was kind of thinking to myself, my prayer to my, praying to God and kind of talking to myself, having a conversation with God. I said, I missed getting the big piece. And it was as, Jesus was talking to me. He says, that's your problem. I said, what do you mean? He says, do you not believe that my presence is in the smallest piece of that wafer as well as the biggest piece? And I said, I know my Eucharistic theology. Yes, Lord, I believe. It's kind of like Martha saying, yes, Lord, I believe you'll raise Lazarus from the dead. He says, you keep looking for me in the big things. You keep looking for my presence in the big things, and you miss the small things. I mean, I had to sit down. I felt like I got chastised. I took out my journal and I wrote it down because I knew this was the word of the Lord. And so this is what I like about this, especially in the story of Joseph, is that here is Joseph. God is prospering his day-to-day things. And so, and I'll share another story that fits in with this. There is a famous monk and mystic by the name of Brother Lawrence. Brother Lawrence Fritch, I believe, fought in some wars, got hurt, got banged up. I think he got shot or something and could barely walk. And so he felt like he had to go atone for his sin. So Brother Lawrence joins a monastery, to kind of pay back God and, to atone and all this. But Brother Lawrence would always say that God tricked him. That here he was in this monastery, thought he going to pay God back for everything. And, you can never pay God back for anything. That's why we have Jesus. That was, Sunday's lectionary reading, that God's mercy is on us. But he began, and he was this type of mystic that if you read his little book called Practicing the Presence of God, you should get the book, very little. Unlike the other mystics of the day who are having these great grand visions and things of that nature, Brother Lawrence found God in the kitchen. Brother Lawrence found God in everything. He does go to Eucharist and do these things, but he's going to pick up wine and he finds God. He's serving a brother and he finds God. He's doing his day-to-day task and he finds God. And so he takes this experience with God, this mystical life that we talk about, this encounter with God. And so his whole life becomes a prayer. This is what Paul talks about in Romans 12, where he talks about presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service, your spiritual worship. And that living sacrifice, we present our bodies, our whole beings, through the living sacrifice of Jesus. We offer up to God everything and who we are in praise and thanksgiving, that when we receive it, our whole lives become a sacrament. Our whole life becomes an outward sign of an inward grace. All of our actions become sacramental. And by virtue of our baptism, we're all called into ministry. You don't need one of these to do ministry. There are certain functions I do because of this, but we're all called to ministry. And what we need today, in a lot of ways, is what we call marketplace ministry, where people in their day-to-day jobs as teachers and psychologists and doctors and janitors show God's mercy and grace in whatever they do. And so, this is Joseph. He is encountering God in his day-to-day life. God is encountering him. And if you notice something, notice it didn't say, though we know that God was speaking, it didn't say that God revealed himself in the dreams of Joseph. He didn't see God in those dreams. He ain't like his grandfather Abraham, his great-grandfather Abraham, or his grandfather Isaac, or his daddy Jacob. He just had that dream. But where does God reveal himself? In the midst of exile, in the midst of him being a slave, in the midst of him taken, in the midst of him being stripped, and in the midst of him really having a lonely heart. So, and so God is with Joseph, and in the first two verses, the God who is not mentioned is mentioned at least 6 times. I may be off one. Either as Yahweh or in your translation, it's the Lord. And so we've got Yahweh. We've talked about Joseph. But now Joseph is in a new situation. And in this new situation, there's another person. And that person is Potiphar. And so Joseph has a relationship with Yahweh, which affects his relationship with Potiphar, because the favor of Yahweh is on Joseph. Potiphar takes notice. Now, Potiphar means he whom Ra has given. Ra is an Egyptian god. In the Quran, he is known as Aziz. Potiphar is the captain of the bodyguard for the Pharaoh or the chief steward. So he is the head of the secret service for Pharaoh. We will talk more about Potiphar and his relationship to his wife, because there is a debate on how to translate captain of the bodyguard, or in my translation, commander of the guard. Pharaoh's official. There's some things going on there. And so, when God is working in our lives, when we are open to the power of the Spirit, people will see a difference and a change in us. They'll say there's something different about you. Now, Joseph ain't going around Potiphar's house saying, I am blessed and highly favored by Yahweh. Yahweh's my God. He's not giving out tracts to the Egyptians, trying to convert them to Yahweh or anything like that, of what we think pious and religious people are. He's not taking the verbal covenant of Abraham and beating people upside the head. No. He is showing his faithfulness to God. He's showing by being faithful to Potiphar. He is in a situation he has no power over. In fact, power has been stripped away from him on a very human level. His autonomy he does not have. He is a slave. However, even in the midst of exile, being away from his own homeland, that immigrant status, even in the midst of being a slave, when power has been stripped and there is no dignity, that never takes away the dignity of you being created in the image and likeness of God. Because it is that dignity that nobody can strip from you. That is a God-given dignity. And that God-given dignity, nobody, no matter how much people dehumanize you and animalize you and anything and make fun of you and hurt you and break you and anything else like that, nobody can take away from the fact that humanity is created in the image and likeness of God. Because God spoke it and that settles it. We're not created in the image and likeness of God because we can think. We're not created in the image and likeness of God because we can feel or certain ways. Because that would mean that, or speak, because that would mean that certain people were not because they couldn't do those things. We're simply made, we are in the image and likeness of God because God said so. That's good news. That's something we can't earn. That is not anything that can be stripped away from us. Now, it can be broken, and it was broken by sin. But there is a God-given dignity to humanity. And what this is saying is that Joseph, though may have been stripped in dignity and everything else by humanity's standards, but God is restoring, but God's dignity now is taking him to his destiny. And so Potiphar saw Yahweh's power and favor upon Joseph. Jewish tradition also says that Potiphar thinks that Joseph is some type of magician. And the reason he said that, is every time that Joseph would bring a cup, if Potiphar didn't specify if he wanted the cup hot or cold, maybe he didn't say nothing. Joseph just hands him a cup, full of a beverage or whatever. And it was still, if Potiphar wanted it cold, when he took it, it was cold. And when he wanted it hot, it was still hot. And Potiphar's like, how can this be? But he knew that it was beyond him being some kind of magician, because he said, we've got plenty of magicians in Egypt. We'll encounter some of them later on. But the rabbi says that Potiphar saw the Shekinah glory, like this veil of glory, this glow about him. And Potiphar may have asked, what's different about you? Joseph, why are you different than everybody else? And we'll talk about how he's different than the other servants and slaves in a minute. But what makes you different? Now, and sometimes what you will see that the biblical narrative does, it will ascribe to Yahweh what others ascribe to other things. So, at first Potiphar might have said, well, the gods are with you. In our day and age, the universe is with you. I go and speak to people, and I'll start reading them like a book. And you know what they say? You must be what? Psychic. I said, well, something like that. We call it prophetic. How are you? Because people don't have words. And so they explain it in their words that they know. And so what Joseph does do by his words and his actions, he begins to display who God is, who Yahweh is. What the Egyptians understood is they understood holy men. Remember the story I told you about Abraham when, God shows up in a dream and says, Pharaoh, leave that man's wife alone. Man, that ain't his sister. Nope. And call Abraham in. And this is what God tells Pharaoh. He's a prophet. He's a seer. Have him pray for you and you'll be healed. The same thing is happening in the same way here. The rabbi has understood that he saw the glory of God. He may not have been able to articulate it that way, but he saw the glory of God upon his life. And so he has favor. So what happens to young Joseph? You got to realize Joseph is probably 17, 18 years old right now. Potiphar makes Joseph his personal assistant and head of his household. Does it sound vaguely familiar? Because Joseph was doing the same type of stuff with Jacob. But what Jacob couldn't do, Potiphar can. And what Potiphar can do is actually mentor Joseph. He may not understand, Joseph's gift. All he knows is that he's gifted. Whatever that is, he is benefiting from that gift. And so Joseph becomes the head of the house. He is the steward of the house. And it says that Potiphar entrusts Joseph with everything and places everything into Joseph's hand except his wife and his food. Ritual purity laws would prohibit non-Egyptians preparing food. That's probably why he didn't prepare the food. Because remember how we talk about in the Bible that Jews had certain food laws that was part of their culture and religion? You don't eat pork and shrimp and other things. the same thing with the Egyptians. Now, he is the head of everything. The master has given him everything. But now notice the connection, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I want to give a foreshadowing of it. Of food and wife. Because he had power over everything but those two. Now you got to see something, see the connection. The hand of Yahweh is on Joseph. Potiphar now releases everything in his hand and what? Hands it over to who? Joseph. See, when the hand of God is upon your life, it causes other people to release their resources, everything in their hand. Why? Because they see that you are trustworthy and you are being a good steward. So there is character that is happening. And what you see throughout this text is there is covenant and there is character. And so, and I don't know why I didn't finish it, that he is preparing foods and that Joseph is the household steward. He is also, we'll talk about in a minute, the household slave as well. We'll get into that. We know that at the end of the story, that Potiphar puts Joseph into the king's prison, which he oversaw, instead of calling for his execution, indicating that he knows that Joseph is being framed, but Potiphar, has to save face. And we'll get into that. But I just want to outline the whole relationship. And then there's E. Does Potiphar treat Joseph like a son? Because he or his wife cannot have children. And the reason I pose that question, we will get to later on, but just file that in the back of your head. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that in a moment. Now, some traditions say that because of a play on Potiphar's name later on in the narrative, that Joseph marries the daughter of Potipharah, and Potiphar and Potiphar are basically the same name. So some say that he may have married Potiphar's daughter and that she may have exonerated Joseph because she too was around the house at the time of when he allegedly rapes Potiphar's wife. But that's a minor tradition in there. And so we got to talk about, we have talked about, and we'll probably end with this one because of time, is that we talked about Joseph's relationship with Yahweh, with God, with Potiphar. Now we got to talk about his relationship with other slaves. Joseph is rejected by the other slaves. We know this from Jewish tradition. Different stories. They talk about Joseph not being like the other slaves, that he is righteous, that he's not messing around with anybody. He's not taking things that are not his. And because of that, he is a goody two-shoes. They reject him. Now, what does this vaguely sound like? Here he is, a goody two-shoes and getting rejected by his brothers because of his favor, and he's getting rejected by the other slaves because of the favor. Because who is this upstart coming up into our house? And just so think about it. And he still probably at this time has to still, see, he is the head of the household. He's head of the household, but he can't live in the house. Mm-hmm. And I'm just talking about thousands of years ago. I'm not talking about today. Mm-hmm. And so Joseph is favored by Potiphar, and like Joseph's brothers of old, the other slaves were jealous and rejected him. When Joseph is made head of the house, he oversaw the slaves and had to keep them accountable and give reports to Potiphar. A modern day analogy is that Joseph is seen as an Uncle Tom and a household slave. That is the modern day analogy. I'm not reading anything into it. It just speaks for itself. They don't like Joseph. He's too much of a goody two-shoes. And I think in the Testament of Joseph, I'd have to go back and reread it, and I'll have it read by next week. The Testament of Joseph is a Jewish traditional writing, and it's Joseph giving his story to his children. And usually these testaments are kind of interpretations of the story. They add to the story. It expands upon the biblical narrative. And in that, he talks about how harshly he was treated by the other slaves because he had favor. And so what that tells us and what we're learning about God's favor upon your life, God's power upon your life, God's destiny on your life is you're not going to make everybody happy. You're not. And for some of us who are people pleasers, we want everybody to be happy. We're going to be happy with other people. We won't be happy with them. But because of what God has called you on your life, other people can't go with you. And sometimes God has to separate you out in order to deal with you so that you can go back and serve. This is what's happening with Joseph. And then, as we will see later, some of these slaves would have loved to see the downfall of Joseph. And there are just folks in your life that love to see your downfall. Mm-hmm. Or something bad happened to you. They love to see it. And in fact, if it's church folks, they love to use God behind it. It usually comes off something like this. And you can begin to unmute now because we're going to go into discussion for a few moments. So unmute yourselves. We want you to be... because we want to have this discussion. So if you're muted, unmute. If you want to talk. Is that they'll say, well, God's going to get you. When they can't handle your personality, they'll use God as their bully. Or you're not humble enough. That's another one. So let's open up for questions, concerns, and we'll stop right there because we'll get into Potiphar and his wife and Joseph next week. You know, that's really the cliffhanger of this, of this story. So any thoughts, questions, concerns of just what we talked about today?
Father Lorraine, you touched on this and I had written a little note because in my Bible it said when Potiphar saw that God's hand was on Joseph, and so I tried to put the history into it to figure out if Potiphar knew that when Joseph was bought, he was bought from a tribe that believed in one God. I'm just trying to figure out how did Potiphar, and he noticed that everything Joseph touched went well, was successful. But I think what stood out with me, that statement, when Potiphar saw that God's hand was on Joseph, and I was trying to figure out how did he know, what did he bring, what did Potiphar bring to the table to help him know that Joseph had God's favor.
So I will tip my hand that will lead us into next week.
Okay.
God, I'm going to say this directly. God nor Potiphar had anything to do with this. It's Potiphar's wife. She likes her young men. And can you imagine when she saw Joseph? I want that one.
Okay, so you think she was doing?
Woo! Oh yeah, she had her hands all up in that mess.
Mm,
But that is not in the text. That is Father Charles's interpretation. But if you read the text closely in Jewish tradition, it's there. You can say that. Not now. Now watch this. And see, what we have to realize is in the book of Job, and I've mentioned this before in other texts, but I think it's very prominent here, is that you have the right hand of God, which God is revealing himself. I mean, you can't question it. I mean, when we talk about the Exodus, that's the right hand of God. I mean, idols are toppling, plagues are coming, Moses raises his staff. But Job, in the book of Job, it's this sleight of hand kind of thing. That it's the left hand of God. And you get this behind the scenes, that it's the left hand of God that works behind the scenes, that you don't really see anything, but you do see the effects. You don't see, Yahweh with Joseph. You just see the effects. And think about it. Potiphar's a good businessman. Potiphar is a government official and a bureaucrat. He's saying everything this kid has, quote unquote, the Midas touch. Everything he touches glitters as gold. I ain't never seen anything like that. And in his head, he is divinely inspired. He has charisma. And so he takes that charisma and he sees it. Now, God knows what he's doing. But I think, honestly, it is the hand of Potiphar's wife, who probably has more of a hand in this. Oh, we got a slave. Oh, that's a good price. We should get that slave, Potiphar. He would be a great addition to the house. And Potiphar's no fool either. But this will all be teased out. I promise next week when I tease out Potiphar and his wife's relationship. Some things have to be teased out. And what we'll be using is not only the scripture text, but we will also be using Jewish tradition and things, and Jewish and Arabic tradition that fill in this story for us. But I do think in that sense, Lorraine, that, as we said earlier, there was always a slave trade between Egypt and Canaan. And so he would have known that he was an Egyptian. You really wouldn't have, you may have Egyptian servants, but you really wouldn't have Egyptian slaves in that sense. So he knew he was Semitic, that he was an Egyptian. Sometimes you will, the term translated is Asian, and it's just Asian is a term that is used as a catch-all term for the Canaanites and all the other ites. There's other terms too, which we will get into, that play very well into this story. So yes, so he may have not have made, he just saw the Ishmaelites, bought them from the Ishmaelites. Joseph probably traded hands from the Ishmaelites and the Midianites and everybody else on their way. But I do think that that his wife had something to do with this one.
Another thing I noticed in the book of Genesis, and as it relates to me today, I see God's unconditional covenant with man, and then his providential care for Joseph, translating his care for me, always providing. If I have the faith, I'm a child of God, I'm a Christian, that his care is always there for me. And so, like Joseph perhaps was taught from his mother's knee about this one God.
Oh, yeah.
And so God always provided care for him. And I think as Christians, we have to remember when the going gets tough, that God always provides for us if we are faithful. And so that's my take on that today, that his care is always there for me. that I don't have to sweat it.
And that God's blessing in our lives is for the benefit of others.
Mm.
Not that it doesn't benefit us, okay, but it is for the benefit of others.
Blessing
And
to be a blessing.
You're blessed to be a blessing. I just had that in my head and it just slipped out. You're blessed to be a blessing. And it goes back to the Abraham covenant of God saying, I'm going to use you, Abraham, and your descendants to bless the nations.
Mm.
And so here is a descendant of Abraham blessing the most powerful nation on earth.
Mm.
Which, as we get into this story, we've got to be very careful as a nation who we want to keep out, because the very people we keep out may be the very one that can save us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's why I put that kind of immigrant piece in there. We will deal with the slave piece later on in the story because it plays a big part. But that here he is coming into a foreign land, getting stripped of everything. And you had, even at times, though there were some restrictions and boundaries, you had this free flow of Canaanites, or all the ites, so to speak, from Canaan, coming into Egypt, being a part of Egyptian life and flowing back up, when the drought's over. Because where's your water supply? Your closest water supply is going to be the Nile. They're still going to have at least some water they're going to have a lot more food than you are. So it's funny how God's providence works through, no matter how broken the system is, the socioeconomic and cultural systems of the day. Not that all those things are good. They're corrupt. They oppress people. But God still can work through the brokenness to display his beauty.
Amen.
And so that's the good news. And that's the good news of all of this text and all of this messiness of Genesis. Like I always tell you, if you feel bad about yourself and your Christianity, just go read the Old Testament, and you will always say to yourself, if God can use them, then God can use me. Because we all in the same boat together. Anybody else? Anybody else got something they want to say?
The devil made or tried to make for evil,
Right.
God returned it for good. And that we have to constantly remember that.
That's right.
Things come negatively to us. That
Right.
we think they're going to destroy us. Because we're in him, he
Mhm.
can turn it all the way around. And sometimes the problem is that we've already planned out how we think God is going to do what God's going to do. But it's not about that. He has a whole way that we may, well, you say, my ways are not your ways, neither are my thoughts your thoughts. So in the accent of the whole thing is that we have to trust God.
That's
that
it.
he's going to work it out. Even through this pandemic, with Trump, with everything that's going on, God is still in control. And somehow, I don't know how, but somehow, through him, he's going to work it out for our good. And I read, what is it, Romans 8:28? And we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. So we know that he's going to work this out for us. And I see that so much in this story of Joseph.
And Joseph, that's right.
And I think we see it in Joseph for two reasons. We always see it at the end, because actually Joseph gives us that whole thing, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, where we kind of put it in that kind of catchphrase. But
Right.
I mean, Joseph says that, but it's all throughout. But it's the hiddenness of God where God is revealed at times. It is, see, God can be hidden, but he can reveal himself through us.
Right.
The revelation of God to Potiphar is through Joseph. The witness that he bears to his God. And next week we'll get into this. We get into the deep, juicy stuff that the rabbis like to talk about when it comes to Potiphar and his wife and Joseph. The juicy stuff.
Yeah.
What happens?
Father, I think also sometimes when we think God's putting us through to teach us something, to teach us a lesson. It may not be a lesson for us. It may be a lesson for somebody else.
That's it. And this is what Joseph will say later on. God sent me before you in order that you can be saved. And so the things that we go through in our life, the good and the bad, you know, we always think about the blessing just being the good stuff. And sometimes the bad stuff is a blessing because we don't suffer it. Sometimes we got to suffer things on the behalf of others. What I mean by that is that we have to suffer things so that later on in our lives, when we're talking and ministering to other people, when we don't understand, why did I go through all that mess? Because it doesn't make sense until we step into a situation where somebody else is going through something similar and we say a word of comfort and encouragement and it hits us. You had to go through that so that you could step into this situation to help this person with the authority and the experience of God. Listen, you know, two people can give you the same advice, exact wording.
You know what?
But we will trust the one who's been through it more so than the person who hasn't. Why? Because that experience gives them a credibility and an authority. So there are just some times, you know, and Paul talks about this, my sufferings are on your behalf.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't like to talk about that. So, you know, we don't want to talk about that. Faye, you got something? I
I have
see.
a question.
Yeah, I got it. I may have an answer.
Who wrote the book Practicing the Presence of God?
Brother Lawrence, and that's the name. That's all we know.
That is the person who wrote it.
And
I just love-
Faye, I have a copy of it if you want to borrow it. I keep it by my bedside to remember that God is in the pots and the pans.
Yeah, this is fake.
Amen.
Okay, I may want to use that as a reference for the one of those meditations. I love that example. That is very powerful. That statement, just the statement of practicing the presence of God, and how we don't, and how He works in small ways in our lives that we often don't. You know, we take it for granted. And that just meant a lot to me to hear that from the lesson today.
And we realize that everything's gift too. Everything's sorry, Christine, I cut you off. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Faye, she just
Hi, everybody. I gotta go.
Bye,
Okay.
Miss Brenda. We love you.
Bye. Christine.
I was just gonna let you know it's really my favorite Christian reading.
Okay.
I found it to be very
Are
central.
you the one that wrote that? Okay. Yeah.
To just help. I when I originally read it, I took it to try to just remember all day long God is with me. God is in the writing, the praying, the eating, the wherever. That's what that taught me, and focus on that. I know He is with me every day, every minute of every day.
Every minute.
Hey, it's one of those things you can borrow it, but you'll probably want your own copy.
You will want your own copy.
Yes.
I call it a Bible book. And what I mean like a Bible book, like I reread my Bible, I reread those books. There's certain books I will reread at seasons in my life that speak differently to me. One of the things about practicing the presence of God, one of my favorite stories is where he, and I am paraphrasing it, but it is pretty close, where he looks at messing up and forgiveness. This is his prayer. And it says, God, forgive me. And if you don't change me, I'm going to keep doing it because I know me. Therefore, I'm going to receive your forgiveness and go about my business. And what he's saying is there, God, I know I'm going to mess up again unless you begin to change me. But I'm not going to sit in my guilt because I've given it to God. I've asked God to forgive me. I'm not going to sit in my guilt. I'm going to keep on pressing on. And what he realized is that he received grace. And I think the Joseph story, because favor, both in that favor, the word for favor there it means the word grace, and grace always means the word gift, both in Hebrew and in Greek. And so that life is a gift. Everything is a gift. And so we have to be, to use a word, to borrow a term for our own culture, to be mindful. You know, you hear about that be mindful, be mindful, be mindful. I'm like, be mindful of what? That's what I want to know. And I get what they're saying, to be mindful, to say thank you, you know, but that's a principle from our Christian tradition, that we're supposed to be mindful of the presence of God in all things.
And
Mhm.
especially all things, I want to just say all people and not things.
Right.
Because one of the most expensive lessons I learned was when our home blew up 30 years ago. It's all stuff. It's all stuff. But what really counts is our relationships with God and with each other.
That's
All
it.
the rest is just stuff.
That's right.
My
That's
mother
correct.
taught me that lesson. She used to say it's just stuff.
Well, you know, and it goes to the point, and I think this story will play out. You'll see this, that in our baptismal covenant, in the 79 prayer book, it says, will you honor Christ, will you honor the dignity and Christ in others? Will you honor them, their human dignity, and honor as Christ in others? It didn't say those others were Christian.
No.
It just says others.
Mhm.
And it goes back to being, there's a difference between being noticed and acknowledged. Joseph is striving and competing to be noticed when it comes to him being with his daddy
Mhm.
and his brothers. What you see is the transformation of Joseph now being acknowledged. It didn't say he competed for his position or jockeyed for his position. It says that Potiphar saw. He saw something there. He saw that he could trust Joseph. So what this testing is doing, and in Psalm 108, it talks about Joseph being tested, and in that testing is kind of the picture there is purging. God is dealing with his character, because Joseph has the charisma. He doesn't have the character, or is what we talked about, the maturity to handle the gift.
Yeah.
And see, sometimes people get a calling from God here, and they want to be, you know, leading over here like 2 seconds from now.
Mhm.
You got to bridge that gap.
And that gap is the process. You know, some preachers love to preach this series as from the pit to the palace, or they'll do something like, you know, I've heard so many variations of it growing up as a kid and in series. But in this, and we'll learn about this, is that Joseph is profoundly lonely here. He has everything and nothing at the same time.
Yeah.
You can have everything and nothing at the same time. You can have everybody and nobody at the same time. Especially if you're in any type of leadership where you're in front of people. Oh, everybody knows your name. They don't know you. And so we will talk about how Joseph, I believe Potiphar knows Joseph. And I'll end with this, and then we'll go pray. Potiphar's wife wants to exploit Joseph. There is power dynamics. There is a Me Too moment in this thing in many ways.
Joseph was the first streaker.
Well, I know, and we'll get to that. But I do want you to keep in mind as we're going through this story, and this is the land. The hand of Yahweh is on Joseph. Potiphar sees that hand on Joseph and then entrusts everything into Joseph's hands. Because that whole hand imagery is all throughout this text. My translation obscures that, and I'll point it out to you as we do it, because there's something about hands and garments. Garments are going to play a big thing in this. So I know we've gone over time. I appreciate you taking the time out to study God's Word. We'll get into the juicy stuff next week.
That's a teaser, Father.
I
Yeah.
know. We get into the novella stuff. I used to tell people, read the Bible. It's better than a novella.
Yeah.
And this is actually scholars call this the Joseph novella. So we get into all that scandalous soap opera stuff next week.
Yeah. And I see my cousin Stacy is on. So
Hi, Stacy.
Stacy.
Stacey.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I really enjoyed the Bible study.
Awesome.
And I know you may have missed a little bit of it. It's okay. It's going to be on our Facebook and YouTube as well. So you can go back and reread and redo and listen closely, take notes and everything. So for our brothers and sisters who miss it today because they're working, they can see it tonight. So I do want us to pray because I'm mindful of time. And so the Lord be with you.
And
Also with you.
Gracious Abba, we thank you. We thank you that you are present with us by your word and by your spirit. We thank you that your favor rests upon us, that you delight in us, you take joy in us, just like that your favor was upon your beloved Son. You take joy in us. And Abba, help us to remember that. When life ain't got no joy and we can't take joy in life, that we know that there's a God who delights and takes joy in us because you love us. And it is hesed, it is loving kindness that is present, God, that favor, God. Help us to always walk in that identity when the world tries to strip us of who we are. Help us, oh God, to be faithful to you because you're always faithful to us. And help us always to remember that your blessing in our lives is really to be a blessing to those around us. And help our church to always remember that this blessing and favor that you have put on this church and the legacy that we live out is in order to be lived out in the world to be a blessing to our communities. And so we ask all these things in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
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 Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
The Father, you have to come closer because sitting back there, he can't hear you. He's still on. Father Willie want to say something to you.
Okay. Hi, Willie.
Father,
Pull up closer.
Father, I hear you. Father, I thank you, and God sent you to us just in time. And
I appreciate that.
I wanted to say that the Lord is passing by and we need to reach out and touch him.
That's right. Reach out our hand. That's it. That's it.
Yes, thank you, Father. And I
Thank you.
I pray for you and your wife in the church all the time.
Well, we need it. We appreciate that. Keep on. Keep those prayers are keeping us going right now.
Yes, I see the blessings are coming.
That's right. Yes, sir. All right, I'll get closer so Willie B can hear me better. I always think I'm too loud, but I got to get closer. I'll do that.
All right.
So thank